Welcome. We appreciate you being here. We're really excited to offer this Local Clean Energy Alliance presents on microgrids. We're really excited because A, we get to share this information with you, and for somebody like me, it's an educational opportunity as well. I'm an organizer with the Local Clean Energy Alliance. My name is Jessica Tovar, and we have other folks in the room. Crystal with the Local Clean Energy Alliance, Al Weinrub, who's passing out the cards with the Local Clean Energy Alliance. We also have one of our steering committee members, Jim Lutz, in the room. And so we just want to welcome you. We also want to thank Corinne for loaning us this space. We are kind of a grassroots nonprofit on a shoestring budget, but we do a lot of really good work. I am the coordinator of the East Bay Clean Power Alliance. Is anybody here familiar with the East Bay Clean Power Alliance? All right. Are you guys familiar with the East Bay Community Energy Community Choice Program for Alameda County? Great. So our alliance has been working for years to establish a community choice program, and we're very excited that it's about to launch next month in June for municipal. Thank you. For both municipal and commercial ratepayers, and starting in fall of this year, it's actually going to launch for residents in Alameda County. So if you live in any city of Alameda County that isn't Newark, Pleasanton, or the city of Alameda, then you will be serviced this fall, no longer with PG&E, but now with a local program called East Bay Community Energy. That's our local community choice program. And so we're really proud of that. I want folks to know that there's restrooms just right outside this door. So if you need to use the restroom, there's 2 restrooms, one on each side. We have food and drink in the back. Please feel free to help yourself. We also have our Clean Power to the People t-shirts, like the one I'm wearing, and we're selling those for $25. We also have Energy Democracy book in the back. And how much are the books, Al? $25 also, which is great. And those are stories from communities throughout the United States of folks that are doing different types of campaigns on energy democracy. And it does feature our story here in Alameda County of establishing a community choice program. And just to be clear, what makes our community choice program so unique is that we've gotten a commitment for our program to reinvest its revenues in local clean energy build out. And what that is an emphasis of solar, wind, and energy efficiency projects throughout Alameda County. So we're really taking a huge step forward into that clean energy economy that we've been wanting to see for a long, long time, right? Okay, so we're really excited about our speakers today. And I would like to introduce Rosana, who's actually done other workshops for us in the past. And so we're glad to have her here again today. She is the communications director for the Clean Coalition, and she has worked in similar roles at 2 clean energy startups and has written extensively on clean energy with a focus on community solar. Now Rosana focuses on getting the word out about the great work that the Clean Coalition is doing.
All right. Thank you very much for the kind introduction, Jessica. And thank you all so much for being here tonight. I'll try to shout because there's a lot of ambient sound here. So we're going to talk tonight about community microgrids, which are the path to resilience and sustainability. And first of all, I just want to tell you a little bit about the Clean Coalition. So we are a nonprofit, and our mission is to accelerate the transition to renewable energy and a modern grid. And we do that with technical, policy, and project development expertise, which is a really unique combination. We have policy wonks, we have engineers. We're not just a policy advocacy organization, we're really creating projects, making things happen. So we're really excited about what we're doing. And our vision is what we like to call 25 by 25, which is that from 2025 onward, at least 25% of all newly added electricity generation in the United States will be from local renewable energy. Now, if you're following renewable energy at all, you may know that a lot of the new electricity generation these days is renewable. I can't even keep up. It's really large amounts. But not that much of it is necessarily local. And we really are interested in local clean energy. And especially the part that's marked here, which is wholesale distributed generation. And that means commercial scale. We're not looking at central generation. A lot of our power right now comes from remote power plants, whether they be fossil fuels or solar power, wind, hydropower. But it can be very far from where people are actually using the energy. And then a lot of the solar that's coming in is on people's homes. And we support all solar, of course, but our area of focus and our sweet spot is wholesale distributed generation, commercial scale solar, which could be a parking lot down the street at your school or something like that. And it's going to serve the whole community. Okay, so basics about how the power grid works. As I mentioned, a lot of the generation is centralized, and it comes through long, expensive transmission lines, which lose a lot of power along the way, into the distribution system. We get the distribution substation here, which is kind of the node from which the power goes out to residential customers, business and industrial customers, and so forth. So this system is not only very centralized, but it's made for all the power to flow one way from where it's remotely generated to people's homes and businesses. And a lot of power is now being generated at this more local level, and the grid is not really made to handle it going the other way that well. So in addition, it's a highly vulnerable system. So the centralized power grid has multiple risks, and you can see here it's costly, aging, and inefficient, and therefore a highly vulnerable security risk. And extreme weather events are occurring more frequently. I think in 2017, just up to September of that year, we had something like 16 extreme weather events that cost $1 billion or more, some of them quite a bit more, so it's very costly. Cyber attacks are a growing risk. If you had a cyber attack, say, on the East Coast, millions of people would be out of power, and it would cost billions of dollars. So it's a big risk. And to ensure that we guard against these risks and provide local and national security, we really need to move to a more resilient system. So what is that going to be? Well, at the Clean Coalition, we think that that will be community microgrids. And I want to show you a very short video to give you our basic vision about community microgrids, and then I'll talk a little bit more about them.
Hi, I'm Craig Lewis, founder and executive director of the Clean Coalition.
And I'm Kenny Klitich, program director for the Clean Coalition, a nonprofit dedicated to accelerating the transition to renewable energy in a modern grid.
We'd like to tell you about the Community Microgrid Initiative, our revolutionary approach to changing the way that the electric grid is designed and operated, encompassing significant levels of clean local energy.
Traditionally, the electric power grid has been based around large, central power plants,
sending electricity through long-distance transmission lines to get the energy where it is actually needed, where people live and work.
We now have an opportunity to redefine how the grid works, to accept large amounts of renewable energy, to avoid significant investments in transmission infrastructure, and to make communities more resilient.
Community microgrids envision leveraging resources like solar,
wind, energy storage, and electric vehicles within community areas to provide at least 25% of a community's total energy needs from local renewables. They can also provide backup power for an entire community during short outages and indefinite backup power for critical facilities like fire stations, hospitals, and water treatment plants.
Our solution is to build a handful of full-scale community microgrids across the country to show how they unleash the power of affordable and clean local energy while providing local economic benefits and unparalleled community resilience, paving the way for the rest of the nation.
Sounds good, doesn't it? So before I get into more about community microgrids, I want to pause a moment and see, just by a show of hands, who feels like they really know what a basic microgrid is? Okay, so a few people have an idea of a microgrid. So A microgrid can be a lot of things, but at its most basic, it's really going to be a small section of the grid that, with controls, can be separated from the rest of the grid and operate independently. Does that make sense? Okay, so that's a basic microgrid, and I've heard people say that a solar backpack could be a microgrid. You know, a house with a battery that could somehow detach from the grid, which is not most houses, could be a microgrid. A commercial location that has its own maybe diesel generator could be a microgrid. But that wouldn't be a community microgrid. So community microgrids, first of all, they're the building blocks of a really resilient power system and a modern approach for designing and operating the electric grid, stacked with local renewables and staged for resilience. So, and I'll get into a little more too about how they differ from a basic microgrid. But a community microgrid has 4 basic components. One is going to be solar, and you can see, you know, in that image there, it could be wind, it could be something else, but most often we're seeing that it's solar. Then there's energy storage, demand response, and monitoring, communications, and control, which if you look this up, you might see it referred to as MC squared. So I'm not going to get into too much about that now, but just to give you an idea of what demand response is in a microgrid, it's going to be a way to help, say, a commercial customer lower their peak demand. They get these demand charges that are based on their highest energy use. So even if that high energy use only happens at certain times, they're going to be charged based on that. And a community microgrid could help them by shaving those peak times. In other words, the battery could be storing energy, and then when the peak time comes, it could release the energy, so the customer could get the energy from that battery instead of from the grid. This can lower their costs 30 to 50%, so it's a huge thing. So just keep that in mind. Those are the basic physical components. The key features are that it's a targeted and coordinated local grid area served by 1 or more distribution substations. And if you go, let me just go back to make sure. There we go. Remind you, okay, here's a distribution substation. So it could be 1 or more of those areas where it feeds out the energy to customers. And of course, it's going to be able to island from the grid. This is important in any microgrid, and certainly in a community microgrid. It's going to have optimal deployment of local clean energy generation, and also this ongoing renewables-driven backup power, and I'll explain that a little bit more, for critical and prioritized loads in the area. And it's a solution that can be readily extended through any utility service territory and really replicated anywhere in the country. So that's an important feature as well. Okay, a traditional microgrid is just going to focus usually on a single customer. Sometimes it's a set of customers next to each other, but probably something at that level. Whereas a community microgrid is going to serve thousands of customers. And like I said before, it could be a few of these distribution substations. So really, you can be serving a whole community. And then here's a handy chart that shows a lot of the differences. I already talked about the scale. A community microgrid is going to span a whole community and serve thousands of customers. The cost is also going to be lower because you're going to deploy distributed energy resources, distributed solar or whatever it might be, more broadly, and also use a systems approach where we're going to designate the areas that are really more optimal for locating that energy. It's not going to be just whoever happens to want to put it on their roof and not just serving the single customer and not doing much for the community. As far as grid resilience and security, a community microgrid is going to provide backup power to prioritize loads that are critical to an entire community instead of backup power to just 1 or a few customers. And as I mentioned, it's much more scalable. A regular microgrid would, one thing I've heard about microgrids is that no two microgrids are the same. It's very hard to replicate them, whereas a community microgrid has a whole architecture that can be replicated much more easily. Here's an important point about the backup power. So people might have this idea that a microgrid can just keep you going forever. That's not necessarily the case. For a community microgrid, we can provide backup power for an entire community, but just for short outages. You're not going to be able to keep the whole community, all the electrical needs going forever. It's going to connect multiple buildings and utility meters into a connected microgrid. And the way we design them, it will include a number of solar emergency microgrids within a pretty close geographic area. So what's a solar emergency microgrid, you may ask? Well, this is really cool because it's going to provide actually indefinite renewables-driven backup power to critical loads. And this can be police and fire stations, emergency operations shelters, hospitals, critical water and communications infrastructure, all the things that are really important to keep going in a disaster. With a battery and solar, you can actually keep these going indefinitely. And it usually has 1 meter at one of those locations. So a key feature here is separating the critical and non-critical loads. Not all of the loads in a community are going to be critical, but a community can decide what is critical to them. If you look at disasters where they're relying on diesel generators, even with the diesel generator, you cannot keep things going forever because not only is diesel expensive, but you're going to run out of diesel. So this is a really pretty cool feature of a community microgrid. So you can see that community microgrids bring a lot of benefits, and they're going to give us 4 benefits that are not provided by our current centralized system. Those are economic benefits, improved performance, resilience and security, and the replicable, scalable model. So I'll get into each of those a little bit. You can see there's a lot of economic benefits. Right? We're going to have lower costs and increased economic investment in a community. We're going to reduce the cost of electricity. I talked about eliminating some expensive peak loads for some customers, but it can help balance electricity in the whole community. And we're going to reduce the need for those expensive transmission lines with the local clean energy. And anytime you do that, you're going to be creating local jobs. All the installation and maintenance is going to be done locally instead of taking those jobs out of the community. The cost reductions in emergency situations are going to be huge. So, like I mentioned, we're going to eliminate the expensive diesel costs. We're also going to minimize emergency response and shipment expenses. If you think about, say, medicines that have to be kept cold or food, there's a lot of things that get lost if you can't keep them going during an emergency and that you might have to then ship in. And we're also going to keep businesses open, which is going to help the community and also keep the revenue going for those businesses. Then we're going to have overall improved performance of the grid. We're going to replace fossil fuels, which is always great. As our transportation gets more and more electrified, this is also going to help with a community's transportation needs. And then we're also going to balance the grid. So with the grid, you need to balance the energy generation and demand, and that's much easier to do locally. And that also, again, cuts costs and reduces price volatility, which is going to help the whole community, all the ratepayers in the area. Obviously, resilience and security, this is a big reason for community microgrids and why they're such a hot topic now. As you can see, they're also cost efficient, but they will provide this definite renewables-driven backup power that we've been talking about, and also just ongoing resilience to the community to withstand multiple disasters. If you look at Puerto Rico now, they're still dealing with the aftermath of the hurricane there, and they're now expecting more hurricanes, and they've had other power outages for other reasons. So microgrids can definitely help in those situations. And like I said, it's a replicable and scalable model. So it can be scaled and deployed in any community. Okay, so where do we put all these cool community microgrids? Well, there's a great opportunity in this vastly untapped commercial scale market. And you may remember that's what I was talking about at the beginning that we focus on at the Clean Coalition, and there's good reason for that. So this is a market that is not only really underserved, but is really well suited for this kind of installation. And by the way, it's the same market that catapulted Germany to be a solar leader and really kickstarted the whole global solar market, because this is what they did. They focused on this market. So commercial and industrial customers are really well suited for this because they're typically the largest electricity users. They have big loads and also the largest emitters of greenhouse gas emissions. And guess what? They also match really well with solar. So they have the most space for generation. They tend to have larger roof areas and parking lots where you can put solar. The system costs are going to be lower than if you put solar on your house. While it's still a pretty good value proposition these days to put solar on your house, you're just going to get a better deal when it's a larger installation. They tend to be at the best grid locations because they have these larger loads that are already served by existing infrastructure at those locations, so you don't have to create more infrastructure. And they match the load profiles, which means that they've got bigger daytime loads. At your house, you're going to be using more power when you come home in the evening, whereas at a commercial location, you're going to probably be using more power during the day, and that's obviously when the sun is shining. And these customers tend to be financially motivated because they've got larger bills, they've got those demand charges I mentioned. So imagine if you could cut your electricity costs 30 to 50%. That's a pretty good motivator. They also have opportunities on their roofs, parking lots for leasing. And here's an example of this amazing untapped solar potential right here in the Oakland-San Leandro area. So there's Alameda there, Oakland, and San Leandro. If you zoomed in on this, you would see there's not a lot of solar on these roofs. And if you've ever flown in and out of the Oakland airport, you might have noticed that as well. So, whoop, go back. So at the Clean Coalition, we did a solar siting survey. That's something we do to identify the technical solar potential in an area. And you can see all these suns show places where solar could go. The P's are parking lots. And we uncovered 650 megawatts of solar potential. That was just with sites that could host at least 1 megawatt each. And this is enough, this was on 250 sites, enough to power 165,000 homes. If you went down a little more to a site half that size, 500 kilowatts, let's see, I think that was, it was even more, it was like something like, let's see, 1.2 gigawatts. And if you went down to 100 kilowatts, you could get probably 2 gigawatts of solar potential. This was in the East Bay Community Energy area, which is a lot of Alameda County. We've done these in other places too. And this really shows that there is a lot of solar potential right here in urban areas. You don't have to go out to the desert to install plants there. There's a lot you can do right here, even in this densely populated urban area. So we think that that's a really good place for community microgrids. So I'm going to pause now. We have a whole second half of this presentation that Matt's going to do with some great examples of community microgrids. But I know there's been a lot covered so far, and I want to see if anyone has any questions at this point before we move on. So, yeah, go ahead.
You identified a certain amount of potential community microgrid generation in Alameda County on your map.
Yeah, really commercial scale solar.
Is that enough to supply the needs of that same area?
Well, that's a good question. That wouldn't be enough to power the whole area. Like I said, it would be enough for 165,000 homes, but it would certainly be enough to power critical emergency facilities during an outage. So you could definitely do solar emergency microgrids at areas that might be used as shelters, fire stations, police stations, critical locations like that. Yeah, and like I said, you could also put in some smaller installations and get even more potential out of the area. So, yeah.
So you indicated that Microgrid is an island, but is it not connected in any way to the existing grid?
No, it is connected to the grid. So the monitoring, communications, and controls that I talked about are what will allow it to island from the grid when there's an outage of the overall grid. But that is a good question. It is connected to the grid, and that's how it can actually serve the whole community, because you can have power from these commercial sites going to for the whole community to use, and the whole community can be using cleaner and cheaper power.
Do they still get a connect fee, a grid connect fee as a result of still being connected to the grid?
Yeah, you can't really get out of that so easily unless you're totally off grid. But yeah, yeah.
So you're working in conjunction with the current transmission.
Yeah.
Trying to replace it slowly in little pieces, or in the meantime, you're augmenting what's available.
Yeah, it's more like augmenting, I would say. Yeah, but yeah, and back there.
You mentioned looking at commercial and industrial users or sites. Why aren't you looking at government and institutional sites?
Well, I think those could definitely be part of it too, and I know that in Palo Alto, for instance, we have worked with some governmental sites, so those would definitely qualify, and I would think those are, do you know if those are part of our solar siting surveys?
Yeah, any flat roof.
Any flat roof, that's, yeah. We're really targeting a lot of commercial sites, but we definitely would work with governments as well, yeah. Yeah, Jim.
How many distribution substations are in Oakland, just for a...
I don't know. Do you know the answer to that? So we can certainly get you the answer to that.
You know? I don't know.
Yeah, I'll look that up and...
I'm just trying to wrap my head around what scale,
100?
Yeah.
what size.
70 to 100 is my total off the cuff guess. It could be more, but I don't think it's many more than that.
But we do have technical experts at the Clean Coalition who will definitely have that answer, so I can get that for you.
Well,
A transformer is a substation.
Yeah.
We define them differently, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But yes, good point.
But yeah, good question. I think I saw another hand there. Yeah. Well, there was one in back first.
It seems to me that the barrier here is storage. Being able to have affordable storage at scale. Where are we in that research and development? How far off is the technology to be able to really bring this cost down?
Yeah, so I realize I probably should be repeating these questions. This one was about storage and how far along we are. That's a good question, and we're a lot farther than you might think. So at the Clean Coalition, we recently did a study showing that solar plus storage would be cheaper than a new gas plant that was being proposed in the Oxnard area. So Oxnard, Goleta, I don't know that area too well. So it's already cheaper on that scale. And basically what's happening with storage now is what happened with solar in recent years, where the price just plummeted. So it's definitely coming down. And like I mentioned before, some of these commercial users have these demand charges that are really driving their prices up. So when you put all that together, all the economics really do come out quite favorably, and they're just getting better all the time. So, you had a question?
Yes, I do. And actually, it'll probably come up a little later. But I'm curious about the administrative sort of organization, or who calls the community grid into action. I mean, from what you've said so far, it's technical. You really want the pieces into place, to have it in place. But what about who controls it? Who is responsible for it? Is it the municipalities? Is it EBCE?
Yeah, that is a very good question. And we have, and feel free to chime in, Matt, but we have a number of community microgrid projects going, and they do all involve a number of partners. So you're going to have municipal partners, you're going to have the utility involved, you're going to have some of these big commercial players who are interested in making this happen. community leaders. It's really a community effort to make these things happen. And it's not like we can just go out and say, oh, we're going to put in a community microgrid. You do have to work with the utility in the area to do that. Do you have anything to add to that?
I'll touch on that a little bit if I can figure out a good way to explain it. It's exactly the right question, though. This is the question. And some people who follow us closely, you know, and I'll switch mics with you in a minute, but you'll know that this is the cutting edge of, you know, the transformation of the energy system. So these are the kind of questions that we're working to answer, and you know, it's exactly what this organization is about, right? It's like, how do you put the community into the community microgrid, and who actually benefits? So I'm going to touch on that a little bit. I hope we'll see how it goes.
I do have one more question.
Sure.
You showed in your diagrams an electric car. Is that a generating function, or is it simply a using function?
Well, it's using, but it can store energy. So
the grid can give energy back from a car?
That's the future.
Yeah.
It's called vehicle to grid. Right now, that's not a common thing. That's also the cutting edge. They're doing a lot of experimentation with that. One of the problems is if you start using your car to power your house, you actually void the warranty on your car battery at the moment. So we're working through some of the hurdles there. But the other thing it does is it can absorb excess energy. So when you have your peak solar in the middle of the day, you want to be charging your car off that excess solar energy, and so that when instead of having to charge it when at night when the solar production is zero. And that's called load shifting, or yeah.
No, I understand that. I didn't understand.
I got you.
Al?
I'm trying to understand from a physical point of view. So the notion of a microgrid is that there's one point of connection to the grid, right? So that means that if you have a whole community, it doesn't have just one point of connection to the grid. It could have many connections in different ways. Is that not true? So I'm trying to understand, like, how you island an entire community from the grid, and would that not take, so the idea is you're using the current wires and infrastructures and everything like that. So how does this happen? Is this just a conceptual idea, like where you could actually through software or something say, well, we're going to take this geographical area and somehow isolate it? Or it does seem like it needs a real physical switch at just one point.
Yeah, Al, that's a great question, and again, right on target in terms of the rethink of the grid, right? So the bottom line is the point of focusing on the substation is that that's where the transmission system meets the local distribution system. And that's the point, and you can tell the difference between the distribution grid, which is our local power system, and the transmission system by what the towers are made out of. So the local distribution grid towers are wooden poles. You see those all over your neighborhood. The transmission towers are the big, giant metal poles that you see along the freeway. So if you think about where the big poles come in and the large wires come in to a community, it's at the substation. And then it is transitioned to the smaller wires and the wooden poles. If we can take that substation area, the entire area that's served by that one substation, and turn it into its own microgrid, so that under normal operations it's connected to the transmission grid, but during emergencies that's the point of measurement, or the switch that we flip, and it becomes its own island of energy resilience for a little while, and produces up to 25 to 50% of its own energy. Yes?
So that seems like a fairly large area that's serviced by a substation. Can you cobble microgrids together to make a virtual power plant model?
Another great question, and I will have to put that on hold for now because I don't want to lose people, but I will come back to that. Should we move on, or are people feeling ready to hear about some examples?
Yeah.
Thank you so much for doing that. Let's give Rosana a hand. That was great. So my name is Matt Renner. I'm the Development and Strategic Partnerships Director at the Clean Coalition. I've been there since January, so I still have to remember how to say that title. But what it means is I'm the strategic schmoozer, and I'm trying out my presentation skills on you all tonight, so bear with me. I brought my parents and my wife so that I have a supportive audience. You can raise your hands if you want.
That's why we sold out.
Yeah, exactly. I got them in the list after we sold out. I really want to thank the Local Clean Energy Alliance for the amazing work you all do. It's really incredible, and I'm so proud to be from the Bay Area where this kind of work is happening. Like I said, the cutting edge of the technology is meeting the cutting edge of community design work. And community design work and the future of how we actually change this energy system is caught up and bound up in the way we change the flows of capital out of our pockets and into the pockets of these giant corporations. So I don't want to bash the utility companies because they do a hard job well for the most part. However, we now have the tools to actually change the way that capital flows and actually have community ownership in these assets we're talking about. So instead of just sending our money in exchange for power, we can actually literally have the power to create energy and keep that money in the communities. What I love about the Clean Coalition, the reason this is my dream job, and I've been following their work for about 5 years, is this is exactly what they're focused on. How do we move using cutting edge technologies, how do we change the paradigm of energy, right? How do we actually change from this top-down hierarchical system where we buy all our energy from one place and essentially it's just extractive, to community resilience and energy independence, starting on our own rooftops and on the rooftops of these giant buildings that we've built that are just sitting there, you know, catching rainwater and dust. We should actually be putting solar panels and batteries in those areas. So the Clean Coalition has been on the cutting edge trying to figure out how to do that, emulating the German model, as Rosana said. The Germans did this first, and they did an amazing job. They gave a gift to the future of the world, showing how we can use the built environment to create our own energy. And in doing so, they've stimulated a concept that for some reason, and I'll tell you there's a lot of reasons, and I also want to recognize Miles Moreno. He's our newest lawyer on our team, the Clean Coalition. You know, the reasons that we haven't done it here, it's a political reason and it's about policy. And Al is one of these other folks in the room who have been fighting on the policy front for years, and it's not easy work. These questions, the answers are relatively simple. We know how to do this. The problem is political, and that's where, you know, coalitions of groups like ours and working together has been crucial, and we're going to move the ball. So I'll start getting into examples now. That's my spiel, though. So how to create a community microgrid project. It is a multi-stage process, but we have tried to boil it down to 5 steps: staging, planning, deployment preparation, deployment, and then operations and maintenance. Essentially, during the staging phase, we identify the sites and produce designs, and then the hard work of aligning stakeholders. Where's this thing going to go? Whose roof is it going to be on? Who owns it? Who's paying for it up front? All these things go into that question. And then we essentially get the groups together, and the ones we're working on, you'll see, are a lot of schools and government buildings who are essentially stepping forward and saying, we'll host this equipment, right? This is new, we're a little scared, but we'll do it because we really believe in the idea. Planning, we actually get into the actual economic analysis deeply, and we work with engineers and construction firms called EPCs, if you hear that term, to actually design and draw all this stuff out and do site walks and measurements and figure out where we're going to have to cut new holes in the ground and put wires to connect all the different pieces of equipment. Deployment preparation, it's the really fun part where we have to go and figure out how to raise the money that's needed to actually install the equipment. You know, borrowing from banks is the traditional way. There's some cutting edge stuff going on with community finance. And then the question about batteries and storage is a really important one. In some of these cases, we actually have to buy batteries that are bigger than actually makes economic sense in order to provide that resilience, right? Because we have to have such a big battery that it can continue to run the crucial operations in a hospital, say, indefinitely. And that means oversizing it and really oversizing the storage. So there are these holes in the economics that we have to fill through other means. And the California Energy Commission makes grants for this type of work. And you'll hear more about that in some of our other projects. And then deployment's the fun part. I haven't been involved in a project that has actually been through the deployment phase yet, but I'm really looking forward to it. We've got a bunch in the pipeline, and I want to actually go put my hand on a battery that's being installed. We're right there right now with one of our projects that I'll talk about in the Valencia Gardens Housing Authority buildings in the Mission District. And then operations and maintenance, that one's pretty obvious, but crucial, right? We have to make sure that it continues to function the way we said it was, and we monitor it and actually try it out. Rosana touched on this, but I'll mention it again quickly. One of the most inspiring things that happened was this really big change last year where California's been talking for years about replacing fossil fuels with renewable energy. The problem is that there's also these other factors that go into making these energy decisions, because you can't just buy expensive equipment and say, well, let's let ratepayers pay for it, because that negatively affects a lot of people who already are getting extracted by their utility bills. So there's been this balance between, okay, natural gas is cheaper, let's buy that and do some renewables where it makes sense. Last year that flipped. And we helped prove it and got real excellent coverage in the media for this, and the consciousness has changed as a result. We were a part of a coalition, but we played a crucial role in showing that solar and batteries, if you design them and procure them correctly, can actually beat natural gas on price alone and can perform the same functions without any emissions, besides the ones that go into actually making the solar panels and batteries. Putting that out there because you'll be hearing more and more about that as we go into the future. So this is my second favorite project that we're doing right now, and it's called the North Bay Community Resilience Initiative. The fires up in the North Bay were a product of a drought and deluge and drought cycle that can be clearly attributed to climate change. And the people up there are ahead of even the East Bay in terms of their climate consciousness, and they're one of the most, I think it's the most dense deployment of electric vehicles in the country. So they get it, right? And when their houses burned down, they said, we want to rebuild this place right. What should we do? And the Clean Coalition jumped in with some advice and started weaving a lot of the players together, which is one of the keys of the organization, is this network. It's a pretty small group of decision makers, and in order to influence the utilities, we said, look, you have a problem on your hands. You may have contributed to the destruction of an entire community. That's up for legal debate right now. But let's do something positive as we rebuild. Let's rebuild this energy system to host advanced energy technologies as a way to say, look, we're going to keep the lights on during the next disaster, whatever it is. And we're going to make it easier for you to charge your car. And we're going to make it cheaper for you to build back or remodel your house with really high levels of energy efficiency. So there's all these subsidies going in different levels where people can actually go all electric for their entire house that they're rebuilding. They don't even need to have a gas line put in, which saves money, because you can get all the functions you need from just electricity. There's a lot more there, but the really crucial factor is that PG&E has embraced us and our approach, and that's huge because they really control the levers of making our lives miserable trying to do this or making it extremely easy. And we're hoping to actually, and we have champions internally, help convince them that this is the way to rebuild the energy system of the future, starting substation by substation, integrating local renewables and providing the benefits. So we're turning something horrible and a clear sign of climate change into something hopefully pretty amazing. Stay tuned on that one. My job is to raise money, and this is a compelling story, and we're raising some money right now to make that happen. We can send you these slides if you want to read all the details. I'm not going to go ahead and read all of them. So one example in the North Bay is that if we were to install 30 megawatts of solar PV, we could do so on big commercial rooftops, in parking lots, and on residential and multifamily dwellings. The exciting thing about this is that, we have these big rooftops that we're not using.
What is PV? I'm sorry.
Photovoltaic.
Say it again?
Photovoltaic. Solar PV.
Solar.
It's what you have on your rooftop.
Solar photovoltaic. Okay, PV is the
Photovoltaic, yeah. I can't even say it, so I have to say PV.
Yeah, right. PV is better to say, but
Yeah, right?
I
So this shows the kind of examples of where we could be siting solar PV. And the benefits are really crucial. So under that scenario, if we were to build 30 megawatts, and the number's actually up for debate and ongoing, but if we were to build 30 megawatts of solar, we'd spend $150 million locally instead of remotely over 20 years. There'd be $50 million in avoided costs associated with using those transmission lines, and that's huge. and $20 million in avoided power interruptions. One thing that we're working on now is the cost or the value of that energy resilience, which doesn't have a hard number on it. It's one thing Rosana's been working hard on in the whole organization. How do we actually price that into our models and get people to account for it? Because energy resilience is worth $0 when the grid is up and everything's fine. But when the grid is down and your breathing machine shuts off, it is infinitely valuable. So how can we use economic analysis to try and find some sort of value there besides death and zero, right? So these are the kind of questions we deal with all day. It's why I love this place. Economic benefits, obviously $120 million in new regional impact, $60 million in added local wages. So this is a way to get real jobs happening in our communities, is build infrastructure here that we can actually use. 1,000 new job years, which is a funny way of saying it, but apparently it's an economic term. $6 million in site leasing income. So people who own these buildings can now make money off their rooftop that was otherwise just sitting there by letting other people put solar panels on it. The environmental benefits are the thing that really got my attention 4 years ago when I first found out about this organization. 46 million pounds of annual GHG reductions from just 30 megawatts of solar PV. 10 million gallons of annual water savings, because there's a ton of water used in production of energy from natural gas and other sources. And 225 acres of land preserved. You know, transmission towers, you might not think about it, but they take up a lot of space. You know, it's almost as bad as a road. And I think it's the #1 killer of birds is flying into transmission wires. So when I saw that, I was like, we got to scale this. That's incredible. We've got a great coalition helping on this project. I'm not going to go through each one, but what you need to know is that people are jumping on board to help the North Bay, including PG&E and including Sonoma Clean Power, who's the local CCA. All right, this is I think I said my last one was my second favorite. This is my favorite project that we're doing. This is the Montecito Community Microgrid Initiative. The reason it's my favorite project is because for 4 years before I joined the Clean Coalition, I've been working in Santa Barbara talking about the same stuff. Let's build a community microgrid. They're doing it up here, the Clean Coalition's doing it, let's do it down there. No one was paying any attention, right? This idea was nowhere to be found. The Montecito is a fancy little community where Oprah lives, but it's in larger Santa Barbara, Goleta region. And that area is almost like an island in and of itself. I don't have a map of the grid there to show you, but it's essentially connected by one wire to the rest of the grid. And that wire runs along the backside of a mountain range that has landslides all the time. So that 220 kilovolt line goes down, they're basically on their own for weeks, months. So my work before this was focusing on this very issue. Now, tragically, there was a massive mudslide in Santa Barbara after the Thomas fire. That was the biggest fire in the state of California history. What it did is it burned out all these bushes and they're all the way to the roots. And then when it rained, an 1.5 inches in a few minutes, all of that debris all of a sudden started flowing. So you see houses like this, in the flow zone. I don't have my numbers on me. I think it was 400 houses got inundated and destroyed. 22 people died. But you see the size of these boulders. These are coming down off the mountain, and these are giant boulders rolling at 20 miles an hour. The flow was 20 miles an hour, and with such force that it was just pushed the entire community off the face of the earth and into the ocean. There was a bear that ended up on the beach from up in the mountains. There's speculation that it was a stuffed bear, but it makes the story a little less compelling. I don't mean to joke about this. It was a serious tragedy, and it really was earth-shaking for the people who lost their homes here. The amazing thing is the change in consciousness in this community. This is one of the most difficult communities to build in the country. I'd say it's probably the most. You can't build a sidewalk or a stair, one step, without having the Coastal Review Commission weigh in. And they now have embraced the concept of community microgrids, focusing on local renewables for their critical facilities. So we're working with the fire department and the water department to put in solar emergency microgrids and expanding to community microgrids at those facilities. How am I doing on time, by the way?
You still have more time.
All right, thank you. the other amazing thing that happened during this fire that was totally unacceptable is that the city of Ventura, where the fire started, they lost power in the first few minutes, I think, or first hour of the event. And as a result, they couldn't pump water uphill. And if you can't pump water uphill, you can't fight fires uphill. So they were sitting there watching this tiny or relatively small wildfire just burn. And the fire department was so frustrated. They said, what's happening here? Let's put this out. And they couldn't, the hydrants weren't working. It led to the largest fire in California history. Wow. And they might have had a chance, at least to limit some of the damage to the cities. So we're focused on bringing energy resilience to those water pumps and to the reservoirs. By the time the fire went all the way up from Ventura to Santa Barbara County, you'd think they'd be better prepared, but it turned out that the energy went off, the power went off again, and some of the taps on the reservoirs would not reclose. So the reservoirs drained and they lost water pressure again. Luckily, the firefighters did an amazing, heroic job saving the city of Santa Barbara and Montecito, only to be outdone later by the rain and the mudslide. So the entire thing has been a tragedy, but out of the ashes in both these places, we're building community microgrids for the future. This is a solar siting survey of Montecito. We get into really small numbers here because it's a packed community. Land is extremely expensive, so trying to find large rooftops is almost impossible. But we're going to string it together. And this shows essentially where some of the siting opportunities are. You'll see the back part is all mountains, and that's where all the flow came down and kind of went like this and like this, all the way down to the ocean. This is a shopping district that we're going to turn into a power plant, essentially. And this is all the fancy little boutiques and coffee shops, and you'll see Ellen DeGeneres sitting out eating at a Mexican restaurant during normal times. But this is all going to be, well, if we can convince people that solar panels are beautiful, this is all going to be a power plant, and we're working on that. So this is called a functional block diagram. This is something I had to learn about because I don't have a technical background. But essentially what it does is it shows you where the different microgrids are going to be placed and how they'll be segmented in a best case scenario. So this is the substation, Al. This is the point of off and on. It comes all the way. This will be an isolated community microgrid, and it's isolated by these switches. This switch is closed, which means power can flow through it. It's counterintuitive. When it is open, it means power cannot flow through it. Doesn't make any sense why they said it that way. That's the way they say it. Each of these red boxes is its own microgrid area, theoretically, in our best case scenario plan. So you'll see that this is actually 2, 3, 4, 6 microgrids in this area that, with this isolation of this big circuit, can all function together as a community microgrid. Now, this concept is really important because, let's say in this area the shopping center I showed you, you have 10 big rooftops, but they're not the same as the places you need all the power, right? So we need the power at the hospital, but we have big rooftops at CVS. What do? Well, we connect them with the existing infrastructure, which is this green wire, and during an emergency, the power from CVS comes through this closed system and all the way over to a hospital. There isn't a hospital here, but you get my point. Essentially, this functions as a more efficient system than trying to do microgrids at each location for a lot of reasons. We talked about it a little bit before in Rosana's presentation. Those critical loads, like the hospital, are called tier 1 loads. And then tier 2 is priority loads, meaning like if we have extra generation, we can actually keep lights on at the school. If we have extra generation, we can keep refrigerators running at your house, maybe even. That's a little bit of a stretch. Basically, and then tier 3 loads are non-critical. Those go out. We don't need to worry about those. Those are not essential services. This is the upper village where the water district and the fire district headquarters are. This is actually our first target, to get those two done first, to make sure that the firemen keep their radios and the water pumps keep their water their electricity running. There's also a gas station up here, and we're trying to get Wells Fargo to sponsor this project, so we pointed out that there's also a Wells Fargo up here. Good luck. Well, they have some goodwill that they need to purchase, and
Right.
we're gonna help them do that. Another thing that's really important to remember is that gas stations actually use electricity to pump gas. So in a crisis, without electricity, there's also no gas. And refrigeration at the market, stuff like that. This is another diagram showing that system. It's not incredibly interesting, so we'll just kind of move past this one. Okay, so moving now from Montecito to up here on the peninsula. This is an amazing project, and this is something that we're actually in the midst of applying for more funding for because we actually want to build these projects. But the Peninsula Advanced Energy Community is a showcase and a replicable model for what you can do when you actually get all the way into the policy weeds of municipal governments and all their zoning and all of their various ways that they can actually change laws and practices to facilitate the build out of local energy infrastructure. A big focus has been electric vehicles. There's an incredible amount of information that's come out of this because it's been a 2-year process at this point, year and a half? 2 years. 2 years of figuring out, okay, what are all the things that need to change in these communities, the San Mateo County, the city of Palo Alto. What if best case scenario, what can governments do to bring about this future? So there's lots of reports that we can send you and you can read all about, but we've been putting blogs up on our website to explain it all and doing webinars and all kinds of talk about this. So if you're interested, get my card, get Rosana's card. Actually, she knows where it's all buried on our website. I think the most important thing here is that this is about to move into phase 2. We're actually going to start building these things. And the focus of this is all on disadvantaged communities. So, people think about the peninsula, they think about Silicon Valley. Well, East Palo Alto and a segment of Redwood City are designated as disadvantaged communities under the Cal environmental screening methodology. Essentially, they look at historical pollution, they look at socioeconomic status, and they look at other factors to determine where investment dollars should come into communities to both address climate change and help clean up historical pollution and air pollution. You'll see this here. This is Redwood City. The pink outline area, these neighborhoods, and then commercial space is all a disadvantaged community. And what we've done here is taken some of the key facilities and done a solar siting survey to see how much solar we can build, and then worked with these different, all these different facilities to actually design community microgrids for their space. I love this one. The reason I'm pointing to the Hoover School is because it's actually a Red Cross designated shelter, and it's right on the verge. We don't have this here, but this is a floodplain according to FEMA. Basically, all of this floods during a high water event. So if you want to shelter in place or shelter your community without having to actually get everyone on the freeway at the same time and drive out, they can all come to the Hoover School with a big field, and it's a staging ground for Red Cross emergency. And if we have a solar emergency microgrid there, it'll have indefinite renewables-driven power, so people don't actually have to leave. And that's key. Especially in these disadvantaged communities, it's almost impossible to actually evacuate. We saw this during Hurricane Katrina. And if you do evacuate, you might not ever get to come back. So if we can keep people sheltered in place and get their needs met locally, there's a better chance that we're not going to disrupt these communities in a disaster. Another amazing part of this project is Stanford Hospital and campus is building this giant facility here, an outpatient clinic. And you'll see here it has 3,000 kilowatts, 3 megawatts total of solar siting availability, and a giant storage tower. So this is going to be a really cool project if we can make it happen also, and we're getting very close. There's more to say about our Peninsula Advanced Energy community, but I'm going to hold off for now.
Could you say more about what a storage tower is?
So it's a solar, it's a thermal storage. It looks like a cooling tower, but it's a heating and cooling facility. So when you have excess energy, you turn it into heat, and you heat this water up and use that hot water in the heat loop. I don't know the details, but it's pretty amazing stuff. And because it's built in already, we essentially get to leverage that asset as a community asset, which gives us all this giant sink for all the extra solar power that we produce during the day. Okay, so the Valencia Gardens Energy Storage Project, this is the closest one we have to actually being built. The batteries, I believe, have been imported from China. They're going into an existing housing facility that I'll actually just show you the picture instead of reading this. This is Valencia Gardens. I think it's almost 300 units of low-income housing and senior housing in the Mission District. You'll see it already has a ton of solar. And they've been cutting edge on solar and energy efficiency for a while. So what are we doing now? We're adding a big battery to prove the concept that that giant battery can provide resilience in emergencies, and it can do some of the important grid services that we've been talking about. So this is proving a key component of our whole theory, is that by adding a battery, you can actually balance that solar much better, and you can actually expand the capacity of that circuit, of this area, to host new solar panels. So by adding this battery, we're going to get another 0.5 megawatt of solar potential, because this battery plays a key role in balancing all the energy and allowing this energy system to actually get more productive. And the great thing is we're partnering with PG&E on this, and this is a key to helping them understand the future, right? It's showing them in practice how these theories come alive and how they help their system, and then they get to make money selling the service of resilience using that battery that they really like. So we got them enrolled. I think this is getting close to the end here. Yeah. So, and then people have been hearing about Puerto Rico. We talked about it briefly. Puerto Rico is installing solar emergency microgrids at all their hospitals. The goal is to get all the hospitals done. You know, it's been 6-8 months since then, maybe more, a little bit more. I don't remember. It's been a blur, but it's a disaster, right? I mean, this is the United States, and some people still have not had any power since the hurricane. And they had a giant island-wide blackout again a couple weeks ago. That second blackout was a real problem, but it also showed the value of these microgrids, because many of them stayed functional during that blackout. There were people who were installing a microgrid and turning it on that day, didn't notice the blackout. Wow. The day they turned it on, the microgrid kicked in without anyone noticing, right? Because that's how sophisticated these things are. They can tell when the power stops working from the grid, island automatically, and kick their batteries on. They went outside and there was chaos, but they were commissioning it and didn't even notice the power go out. That's the power of these things. And this, you know, the Puerto Rico example is exactly where we need to be focusing on how to rebuild energy systems after disasters. The problem is they're spending $17 billion in an area that is pretty devastated, and they had to rush back in and do everything they could as quickly as possible. They didn't have time or the political will to really focus on how we should redesign the system. So it won't be a perfect test case, and their energy system is going to be problematic for a while, but they do have 62 hospitals that are building these, and they're planning on more, I believe. This leads me to talk about why the North Bay project and the Montecito project are so critical, because we have small and relatively easy to access communities that can actually prove this model for how to rebuild after disaster. You know, it has become abundantly clear that we're going to be rebuilding after disasters more frequently. But if we can do so in a way that's actually smart and actually lowers our carbon footprint as we go, it won't be a complete waste. So hopefully that's a somewhat optimistic note to end on.
We tried.
And then, yeah, I'd be happy to answer any questions that have come up since then. Yes, please.
You know, this new state mandate for, I think it's 25% of residential homes have to have solar installed on them. Mm-hmm. Does the rebuild construction, you know, that insurance companies will have to enter into, is that going to be covered by that law, or do they get to slip under it?
Great question. I don't know the answer to that, but yes, please.
If you build new construction or substantially modify a building in California, you have to follow the California building energy standards. as people want them, as soon as communities adopt them. But starting January 1st, 2020, all new construction in California will have to have EV on it.
Yeah.
All residential.
I'm wondering if the rebuild.
So the rebuild that's going on now won't be subject to that, but
I think some of
in the future,
communities up there are already pushing.
yeah, it's an interesting question, right? Because you don't want to slow down or make people who are struggling to pay for rebuilding their house also have to pay $20,000 up front for a solar system or finance it. So there will be many variances given, I think, for circumstances like that. That said, there's incredible incentives for people to build back with a higher energy efficiency, and then there's an even higher level of incentive if they commit to 20 years of buying only local solar through their CCA, or if they put solar panels on their rooftops themselves. So it's happening. It's being leveraged really well. Yes?
I've got 3 issues I want to discuss. First, I guess it's a little bit humorous, but you mentioned Germany, and last night or the night before I saw a documentary about Holland, where they're using all the rooftops for urban gardening, and I can see this war between the urban gardens and the urban solar.
It's a great question. Yeah, my understanding is that a lot of people who are mandating the use of your rooftop for something useful are choosing either green roofs or solar roofs. There's combinations of the two. Also, you can have both.
The second, you addressed a little bit, but I'm still not clear about it. I see a potential here for energy apartheid, where well-off communities like Montecito or the North Bay, where there's a lot of capital,
it's a great point.
Wealth, can make this technological change, whereas poor communities are going to have to wait for a government grant or the good graces of PG&E or something else.
Yeah, so there's a lot there, obviously, but it's a very good point.
One more thing, in East Palo Alto, my knowledge of East Palo Alto comes from the 80s. It was the last affordable place you could live. It was a pretty poor, rundown place.
True.
It's being totally gentrified.
Yeah. So these issues are actually really interesting the way they weave together, right? One other issue just to add to the plate is there's a lot of housing being built in the Bay Area in some areas where it's possible, right? And the city of Richmond is considering what do we do with our city as we have these pressures from gentrification. All these people want to build solar panels. It's a great place for them, but is that the best use of an open space? Probably not. We want to put housing there first and then put solar on top. So these are the kind of the various issues that are coming into play. About the energy apartheid piece, obviously very close to my heart, given where I'm coming from on this. We have to figure out how to make this a just transition. And I'm not an expert on that, but there are many here in the Bay Area, and it's deeply woven into this organization and the considerations at the Public Utilities Commission. The environmental justice community has done an amazing job getting those concerns front and center in these policy discussions. So rest assured that here it's happening. Other states, I'm not so sure, but California is setting a standard that's pretty impressive.
You anticipated this is my third point. The jobs question.
Yes.
I come from the labor movement.
Me too.
Has this presentation been made to IBEW?
IBEW is a mixed bag on this stuff. A lot of their locals really support, and I'm speaking just as myself here, not as a representative of the Clean Coalition, because I don't know the politics here, and it's a little hairy. But let me just put it this way. A lot of the locals in IBEW, the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers, they're the ones that actually build the transmission lines and maintain them. Originally, they sided a lot with the incumbent utility against the community choice aggregators, and were kind of the attack dogs for a lot of that fight, because they want to, they just like a regulatory agency can be captured by the industry it's supposed to regulate, so can a monopoly utility be captured by the interests of the corporation they essentially work for 100%, right? But the locals get it, and they see an opportunity here. And so it is important that we all speak to our brothers and sisters in the labor movement about the green economy and how it could actually work. They're skeptical, and rightfully so, right? They don't have the luxury of people like me who get to go and sit in a chair and study this stuff. They're actually building it, so and they need to protect themselves.
The Alameda Labor Council now has an environmental justice caucus, and I would like to get this presentation made to the
Sign me up, anytime.
IBW 595 is part of that. They're the ones who run the Zero Net Energy Center now.
So they're going to get it. I'm sure they like it.
They're going to get it.
Yeah, yeah. It's the transmission wires and the the real problem is political corruption. I'm not going to beat around the bush here. We need the connection to be made between the actual interests of the locals and what they're hearing in the legislature. So whatever you can do on that front, you'll be fighting a very important fight. Yes.
What I wanted to say about the economics is, as somebody who is a representative of the Public Bank of Oakland,
nice.
There is a public banking movement throughout the state and throughout the country.
It's incredibly important.
We're going to be the funders.
Yep. I'm really glad to hear that. Yeah, thank you for being here.
I just want you to know that's one of the things that we're all trying to build in to our values and what we want to fund.
If I can be of help in any way, let me know, because public banking is one of my third favorite causes.
The other thing I wanted to say is about green jobs. Number one, you've got to get out to all the high schools, and then so the kids and then their parents will understand that this is a way of the future for the youth. But then I also want to ask you, is it just like a one-trick pony job? It's like, okay, so you install the panels and then that's it, there's no more jobs. Or are there maintenance, are there continuation things for these kind of jobs?
Compared to other energy industry jobs for electricity, absolutely. There are more in solar. I think it's 10 to 1 or something created by, that is a problematic argument in some ways when you're talking about the efficiency of deploying capital, but it does actually create more jobs per megawatt produced. The other thing is that next time you fly anywhere, look at the flat roofs around you in whatever city you're in. There is a crazy amount of potential for this. It is unbelievable how many systems are to be built if we go this direction. So there will be lots of jobs. Yes?
That goes to my question.
Okay.
And that's, what is the impact of leasing those rooftops have on, say, future development potential for the landholders, property owners? Does it retard, the interest in, their properties?
Great question. A little above my pay grade, but what I would say is that these are generally 20-year contracts, and it's like any other lease. You commit to it, and you have to honor it. It's a choice, but most people aren't using their rooftops, so it usually makes sense if we can. And there's a lot more to this presentation and a lot more to dive into in terms of the economics. But that's the key, is getting the economic drivers right so that people who are not using their rooftops just have to sign on the dotted line and they get 20% of the profit for just having a roof, right? Let's make it really simple and standardized. Can I get one more in?
Oh,
yeah. Yes.
Thank you. So could you comment on, my impression is in terms of the opposition to all this, that isn't it true that PG&E and other industrial utilities get most of their income now from the transmission and the infrastructure that is really in competition with local clean energy generation, right?
Great question. I'm not an expert on this, but what I can say is that, yes, they say that generation is a pass-through, so they don't make any money on actually generating electrons. That's not exactly true because of some of their ownership of legacy assets like Diablo Canyon, but that's a whole other kettle of fish. Yes, and there's a real tension between transmission and distribution assets, and that's something we're fighting on all the time. I'm happy to talk more about that. I gotta wrap it up.
A real simple question.
What?
When you provided a cost-benefit analysis, you included this savings in transmission lines, but they're still there.
Yeah, this is new transmission build, and it's stress on existing transmission.
So we reduce the stress.
Yeah.
You don't build any more.
And that's the thing, is there's this giant curve of transmission growth that's coming if we keep going the direction we're going. There's a lot of reasons. Me and Al talked about it today for a bunch. Yeah, happy to talk more about that too offline. Thanks, everybody.
We have one more speaker. This next speaker is Marna Schwartz. She's with the Berkeley Beat Microgrid project, and she's with the Office of Energy and Sustainability Development. So go ahead.
Thank you, Jessica.
I have about 20 minutes and then 10 for Q&A.
Okay, great. Thank you for having us. I work for the City of Berkeley in the Office of Energy and Sustainable Development, and I work on our microgrid project, and like Clean Coalition, we received a grant from the California Energy Commission to do an analysis and look at the possibility of building a microgrid, to do a true feasibility analysis. So our project comes out of our resilience strategy. The city of Berkeley was, in 2014, was honored as one of the first 32 of 100 resilient cities. And so through the Rockefeller Foundation, we were given money to develop a resilience strategy, to really think about what are the qualities we need to work on as a city to make sure that our city can bounce back from any disaster that comes our way. And one of the main components, as you both have spoken to, of resilience is energy assurance. So we wanted to really think about what are our critical facilities, and what are the needs of those facilities, and how can we ensure that there is energy assurance for those. So traditional microgrids are often at a campus level. They're on one piece of land that's fully owned, private land. You don't need to go across any streets. You just are located on a hospital grounds, in an army base, something that is fully private. They're often designed, financed, or owned by a utility, or they're part of a new plan development. And what we wanted to do was we wanted to take the existing fabric and buildings in downtown Berkeley and see if we could connect our buildings together to share power and to see how we can, in order to reduce any power, when power is more expensive, to reduce those costs, and in the case of an outage, to island from the main grid and be able to provide backup power. So the goal of the BEAT project is to focus on advancing something completely different. It would be connecting these multiple buildings with clean power, with solar, and with battery, and aggregating our loads, designing something that could be scalable and replicable so that other cities could take our work and just use it in their communities, and in particular in urban areas. So it was something that no other community had tried, and so we have some lessons learned. Not all of them are 100% positive, but we want to share out exactly what we've learned. So here's our team. We got, as I mentioned, $1.5 million from the California Energy Commission, and we put together a consulting team. The City of Berkeley is the main lead on the project. We have ABAG, the Center for Sustainable Energy, who have been doing a bunch of our policy research and are looking at our regulatory work. Interface Engineering is a electrical technical firm. Of course, LBNL as scientists and as technical. NHA Advisors is a financial. They look at how to put financing packages together for cities. URS is our main lead consultant. They will also work on the technical and the financial side. And then West Coast Code Consultants does plan check and how do we get through the permitting process. We also have a technical advisory committee that includes PG&E and EBCE, among a number of other, USDN, which is the Urban Sustainability Directors Network, a number of other folks who are really interested in microgrids and can provide some technical assistance to us. And PG&E has been with us through the whole process, and you really need your utility to be on board with what you're trying to do because they're the gatekeepers. So it was really important, one of our lessons learned, really important to bring in PG&E from the get-go and ask lots of questions because not only are they in charge of the interconnection between the main grid and any kind of power sources you have, but there's a lot of regulatory work that needs to happen in coordination with your utility. So our timeline has been that we started, it's a two-year program, a two-year grant. We're just culminating in June. So we've done the majority of the work. We started with doing, in coordination, a regulatory, financial, and technical analysis to see what was the feasibility and really to do a lit review of everything that has existed prior. And then really we had two main products that came out of that. We did a case study that was something that could be applied to other communities. So how could this be replicated in other communities? And then really creating a shovel-ready design. So 30% engineering design to look at how can we actually build, what would be required, what would the loads look like, which buildings would be connected, and so forth. And then ultimately using that knowledge to put it in a final report and do some workshops so that people can understand what we've learned and where we're going. So our proposed BEAT buildings, this is downtown Berkeley. If you're familiar, we're redoing our Center Street garage. It's going to be a very Berkeley garage. It's going to have solar panels. It's going to have a rain catchment system, bike valet, an art gallery. It's going to be very Berkeley. So, but the important part of all of that for our microgrid, what was that? Oh, I wish, I have a child. But the important part for this project is that it has solar on the roof. So we're putting 100 kW on the roof with a already built out as of maybe next month. And then we're going to have up to 318 kW and it's full build out. And then we're going to try, our goal was to connect that with our two administrative buildings, which house a lot of our public works services and whatnot. And then our public safety building, which is a call center, 911 call center, police department, fire department headquarters, and our emergency operations center. So a really critical facility. And so you can see that the green line was prototype 1, which connected all of those. Prototype 2 looked at also connecting a couple other non-public facilities, so looking at Berkeley High School and the YMCA, which could be care and shelter sites in the case of an emergency. And then and then you can see where between the red and the green lines would actually be where we would connect those buildings. So we would put new distribution lines in between those buildings in order to transfer power from one building to the next. We came up with a prototype 3 after doing some analysis that would be solar plus storage, so it would be not a true fully connected community microgrid, but rather solar storage at each of these individual sites. And so that would be at our Center Street garage, our Civic Center, and our public safety building. And we're still actually looking at a couple other facilities. But the reason why we had to come up with a third prototype is because we learned some things along the way. So community microgrids are feasible. We didn't know that in the beginning, right? They have never been done in an urban center in quite this way, where there's redundancy already in the lines, where there's existing infrastructure. It's a very built out area. And so we did our regulatory, financial, and technical analysis. There's no law, there's no, technology is not, there's no problems with the technology. It's all feasible. The problems are that they're very expensive. So you have to, in order to build new lines, well, in order to connect the buildings, you either have to use the existing distribution lines, or you have to build new distribution lines that physically connect those buildings. PG&E will not allow us to use the existing distribution lines because there's so many other customers on those lines. You'd have to manually turn off hundreds of other customers and get an MOU, an agreement, a contract with each of those customers to let them know that their energy would be turned off in the case of an emergency when the microgrid went on and it islanded. So they were not interested in doing that, and so we decided that we would build new distribution lines, which is very expensive, anywhere from $1 million to $5 million a mile to trench, to close off traffic, to build new lines. What we're going to apply for phase 2 funding, just like Clean Coalition, to build this from the CEC. And so we're not actually that worried about that cost, because we were hoping it could be funded through the California Energy Commission. What it turns out that the real obstacle on costs is there's also a one-time transfer fee. So once you build those distribution lines, you as a city cannot own and maintain those. Only a utility can actually run distribution lines. There's a statute in the California PUC code that says you can only share electricity between contiguous buildings, so buildings that are right next to each other. If you cross the public right-of-way, 218B says that you must be a utility in order to pass power across the public right-of-way. So we would have to deed back those lines that we paid for back to PG&E to then own and operate. And then the next issue is that they charge a 6% annual fee for operation and maintenance for eternity on those lines. So it's very expensive to do. So that's why we came up with the prototype 3. And I think I sort of highlight them. I sort of went through them, but I want to just highlight them again because they're kind of confusing. So a utility must own and operate the distribution lines. We cannot use the existing lines because there's too many other customers. They're expensive to build. And then we asked, okay, so if we build all of these lines, then can we at least share power? We produce enough power on our Center Street garage and then not as much power on one of the other roofs that's already congested with HVAC systems and whatnot on the roof. Can we share that power? Which is what the ideal microgrid looks like and sort of the concept. But because they're on separate meters, even though we're the same customer, we're all City of Berkeley, each of those buildings, you can't aggregate power between those buildings. You all have to be in the same meter. So even if we built all of that, there's a challenge in it. And then ultimately, it's still very new. Microgrids are still very new. So there's not a rate structure that exists to date. And PG&E and the CPUC is thinking about how to put together a rate structure that would be positive to storage and positive to microgrids, but at this date, you still have to use the existing tariffs. So you can use a NEM tariff, which is a traditional tariff for solar, or cities have the opportunity to use something called a RES BCT tariff, which is similar to a NEM tariff. But there's not one that's specific to microgrids yet. And so ultimately, we've looked at solar plus storage. And what I don't want to leave this on a negative because I want to share all our lessons learned. But I also want to say that the solar plus storage, what we're excited about for it is it's a first step towards building a microgrid. You're putting all of the equipment that you need in place so that when regulations or financials change, you ultimately can connect those. And so we really are seeing it as a first step, as a way to be able to build out some of that. And then ultimately, it allows you to do all of the resilience benefits of a microgrid, given our current situation. So if the only difference between the solar plus storage and a fully connected microgrid would be your ability to aggregate power between buildings. So saying one building wouldn't necessarily have to produce all of the energy that was needed to power it. You could share it through. And we were really excited about that idea because you can't necessarily be a zero net energy building in and of itself. Not all buildings have that capability, but perhaps you could be a zero net energy community and share power between the buildings. So with solar plus storage, you're not able to do that, right? All of that power is based in one site. But like I said, we're seeing it as a first step. We're seeing it as a way to really have a shovel-ready project that could be built tomorrow and that will allow all the resilience benefits of critical loads, islanding from the grid, providing resilience for the city. So we're still excited about it, but I want to be really clear that there are some challenges to doing microgrids as it currently stands, which just means that all of us who know about this and are working on this, need to share together the knowledge and use that leverage to advocate at the CPUC level for changes that are beneficial so that we can become a more resilient community and really advance these distributed energy resources and these microgrids and so forth. So that's my spiel. Let me give you, I have some flyers if anybody's interested that I brought that can be passed around, and I would be happy to answer questions. Yeah, so I think you in the blue had your hand up right in the beginning.
Yes, I wanted to ask, it seems to me there's going to be a major legislative component that's going to be needed for this.
Mm-hmm.
So, and you may not know this. First, I want to commend you for all the amazing work.
Thank you.
And your group.
Thank you.
But I want to say, and especially now with all of this new technology, with elections coming up, what's going on in our country, with people needing single-payer health care, I think that this kind of new legislation is going to be much more willingness and impetus to implement it. But what I want to know is it like that because it's based on archaic technology, or is it because of capitalism set up to, favor?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I can answer parts of that, I think. So there is legislation. There's some that's pending right now. Wiener has a great bill out there. I can't remember, 700, I think, SB 700. There's definitely movement to institute and institutionalize more incentives and sort of ease and taking away barriers to building these kinds of things. But we're at the forefront, and we were excited to be a pilot. We really want to be the showcase and highlight what's possible, and even if it means spending a little bit of extra money. But there still is work that needs to be done, I guess. There's, I would say, just on the capitalism point, that there's the business model of the utilities is changing. So because of CCAs, they're really focused on distribution and not so much on the procurement of energy. So they're going to be holding tight to making sure that there's a business model that still holds that, that they're financially savvy about that. So as when you start connecting buildings, you're getting into the distribution. So that's it's going to be a little bit interesting. Yeah.
Since your work seems to have really daylighted a lot of the obstacles, especially from PG&E, I'm hoping your report sort of goes through that. It isn't just focusing on what you accomplished, but does it sort of discuss all these obstacles there?
Yeah, and our case study in particular, oh, that was a different slide, but our case study in particular, we really want to distribute it widely. We're in, as a city, we're in very tight communication with other city staff, and we really want to make sure that they know all of this as well, so that we come together forward. And so, yeah, we're looking forward to sharing all of that information. Yeah.
How far out of the box did you think? Did you talk to Alameda Uni to see if they could run your distribution?
Yeah, so we did.
Did you think about, it's a parking structure, so you should have could have a lot of electric vehicles there.
Yeah.
You moved the batteries.
Right. We did think out of the box. Yeah, we did, absolutely. I'm glad that you brought all of those things up because we did actually, we've checked a lot of boxes. So we are definitely having a lot of EVs, charging stations within the garage. We looked at mobile batteries. We looked at, we even looked at mobile buses, electric buses, because they have a larger battery. We looked at, we asked our city attorney about municipalization, which is creating our own municipal utility, which would, you know, that there seems to not be an appetite currently for that. We talked to, another option would be to have another municipal utility take us over, you know, take over this microgrid, which is also challenging, but we looked at that as an option. So yeah, so we did look at a lot of different options, and it's just not quite there yet. So we want a shovel-ready project.
Will those be in your report?
I'm not sure we're putting all of those in. I'm not sure. Yeah.
We would like
I know we put the municipal, like what it would take to be a municipal utility. We talk about that a little bit. I don't know if we talked about all of our different battery, and we also looked at flow batteries. We looked at, you know, we looked at a lot of different ideas. So.
We would like them.
Okay, that's good. Thank you for noting that. Yes.
So you dealt mostly with controlled properties. What if you had a, you know, a block area, you know, say 4 or 5 blocks, where everybody within that block area was part of the microgrid?
Mm-hmm.
Would that enable you to go and essentially acquire the distribution system that's in place within that smaller area?
Yeah. So there's a.
You essentially condemn it and take it over.
No one really likes when cities take over property, but yes, no. Okay, I'll answer this in multiple ways. The project that is furthest along in this way and has had the most success with working with the utility and really being able to do this is a project up in Humboldt County. And they've been able to, they're going to create a multiple customer utility, microgrid, excuse me, in conjunction with their CCA and PG&E, because they're the end of a line. So there's 17 different customers, I believe, including an airport and so forth. And they're going to be able to do it because they're the end of the line. There's no other customers beyond that. Well, the problem for us in downtown Berkeley is that there's so many other customers. And it's not just contiguous or next door buildings. You could have somebody be on, in fact, they do that on purpose for safety. So a building right next to you may not be on the same distribution line as one 3 blocks away. In order to really ensure that there's power to different buildings, and that one power line isn't just cut and everybody's dark. So you know, they see our area, like utilities see our area as really rich with redundancy in a great way. So there's a lot of different feeders that come in, but for trying to build a microgrid, it makes it more complicated.
Maybe we could do one more.
Sure. Sure. Yes.
I hear a lot about how difficult the storage issue is. But in presentations, I haven't heard that that's a difficult issue. Like in your map of downtown Berkeley.
Yeah.
Well, could you say something about the storage?
Sure.
Yes.
Yes.
What kind of mineral or?
Yeah. So the storage is. I think probably the largest issue is the size of it, right? At this point, it's about the size of a what are those called? The that comes on the trains, the container. Thank you. Didn't sleep that well last night. I have a 1-year-old, so that, you know, finding a place to house that, right? So we have a space in the garage that we've designated on the ground floor. They're heavy also, right? So you can't put them on roofs or things like that. So you know, finding a place that's okay to put them, and then making sure you have an enclosure. There's current in the next code cycle, they're coming out with new fire code requirements about enclosures for them. So, you know, there are some some permitting issues that you need to think about. For us in downtown Berkeley, we have also landmarked a lot of our city buildings. So, you know, you have to go through the landmarking process, but that's unique to us. So, so, you know, thinking about where they're located, but they're not, beyond that, they're pretty stable. You know, they have to make sure that there's cooling. You can't just have them be completely enclosed, but, you know, yeah, they're pretty stable. Does that answer your question?
What is the problem is this size?
Largely the size, I would say.
Going forward, that is going to be the problem. Is that how you see it?
Yeah, I think that yeah, it takes space, right? And then I think that also technology will change and they will get more efficient and smaller. Both of those things I think will happen. But I'm not a tech person, so that's my guess.
Cool. Well, thank you.
Thank you.